Hi everyone, and welcome to another Filipino Time unboxing review video. This time we are going to check out these two Seiko land watches, one from the Seiko Prospex line and the other from the Seiko 5 line. And it's very interesting for this one because there's a couple of watches that serve sort of the same purpose from the same manufacturer from different lines. So I'm looking forward to checking this out. And with that, let's get right to it. Now, it's very difficult to see from the camera, but we'll try to get you some close-ups. The bezel and the dial actually are a very, very dark blue. And under most lighting conditions, they will look black, but the more you look, the closer you look, the more you see this very beautiful, deep, very, very muted blue. And it's almost like the color of the water in very deep oceans. Not that I dive, mind you, and not that this is a diver's watch, but that's kind of what it looks like. And it gives it a very, very nice feel, very nice aesthetic. The outer bezel, which you can see the graduations from 5 to 60, is unidirectional. In other words, only goes one way. Won't go back, just one way. The inner rotating bezel, on the other hand, which has the north, south, east, west compass function, is bidirectional. So it goes left and it goes right, or clockwise, counterclockwise. As with all other Seiko 5 models, this has a day and date window. And as with the Seiko 5 sports models, it's a 200 meter water resistance rating. One of the interesting things to note about this is even though it's a J1, which means a Japanese release, oddly enough, it has the Arabic date on it, which, quite frankly, I've never seen before. And maybe I just haven't seen enough Seiko 5s, but there's just something very interesting. Operating the crown is, as well with most other Seiko 5s, just unscrew the screw down crown, and first click would operate the date by going clockwise, and day by going counterclockwise, as you can see here. One more click and you can adjust the time. Powering the Atlas is the 7S36 movement, which gives you about 40 hours of power reserve. It's the updated version of the 7S26 found in the Seiko SKX007 and, basically the SKX range in general. It's a very reliable movement, very rugged, and, no nonsense, nothing fancy, just gets the job done all the time, every time. All right, now let's try this bad boy on for size. As I said earlier, it's got the veritable double clasp and button system that most modern Seikos currently have. And again, 42 millimeter, but doesn't look too big. Granted, I do have a 7.5 inch wrist, so most watches wear rather small on me, and if you have a smaller wrist, it'll definitely feel much bigger. But it's actually quite comfortable in the wrist. This oyster style bracelet is nice to feel on the skin. Not too heavy. Strangely enough, I expected it to wear much heavier than it does, but all in all, it feels like if I wore it on a daily basis, I wouldn't feel tired, or I wouldn't notice the heft so much. Now it's time to check out the other watch, which is the SRPA71K1, aka the, like I said, no nicknames, but the Land Prospex. And much like the Land Shark or the Atlas, this has a inner rotating bezel for the compass, and well, again, 2 crowns. Obviously, one for the date and time, the other one for the internal rotating bezel. It's also 42 mm diameter, but well, noticeably thinner at 12 millimeters. And because of the shape of the watch and how it's designed, it doesn't look as bulky. The thinner bezel, both crowns on one side with much smaller crown guards. It makes it look a little bit less clunky as the Land Shark. The SRPA71 also has a 4R35 movement, which honestly is very similar to the 7S36 on the Land Shark, with, well, 3 major exceptions. The first is that it only has the date, no day, and it has, well, both hacking and manual winding functions, which the Land Shark's movement does not have. Personally, none of these are deal breakers, so picking between the 2 watches would be much more of a aesthetic choice rather than a technical one. Speaking of technical choices, you can definitely see the dial here is geared much more towards legibility, with very, very large, bold numbers, 12369, and the compass inside with, the graduations, not just north, south, east, west, but you also see northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest, and even in between that, north, northwest, north, northeast, and so on and so forth. Aesthetically, it also has multiple surfaces, or multiple surface finishes, I should say, with both polished and brushed finishes on it, which gives it a bit of more of a premium look and feel versus the Seiko 5. Also adding to the more premium look and feel is the exhibition case back, where you can see that 4R35 moving. Unlike the Land Shark, this Prospex does not have a screw-down crown. At its, first position, which is closed, that activates its manual wind function, which you can do by rotating it clockwise. In its first position, that is to set the date, as you can see there. Second position would be to adjust the time. As you can see, the second hand is stopped when I pulled it to the second position, denoting it has the hacking function. The second crown is to adjust the inner rotating bezel. One thing I do like about this model over the Seiko 5 is that the crown here actually is, feels tighter. The crown on the Seiko 5 moves with even just the slightest touch, which, it can make the bezel function a little bit more difficult, a little bit trickier to use. Whereas in this one, set it, leave it, even with incidental contact, it sticks. And to me, that's a good thing. Speaking of the compass function, I thought it would be a good time to sort of dive into how exactly the compass function works on these watches. And, there's several things to remember before you start. The first is we have to know which hemisphere we're in. Now, being in the Philippines, we are in the northern hemisphere. Just barely, but we are. And, if you look at a map, most countries, most land masses are in the northern hemisphere. Unless you're in Australia, South America, Africa, and some other, a few other places, Antarctica, obviously. But for the rest of us, most of us are in the northern hemisphere. Another important thing to know is if you happen to be in a country that observes daylight savings time, which in the Philippines we don't, you will need to set it up so that it's in normal GMT time and not in daylight savings time. You have to set the watch back, or else this just won't work. Now, let's go on to actually using it. So the first thing you have to do is, well, preferably, I prefer taking off the watch. Some people don't really have to do it. But I take off the watch because you would have to set it at level to the ground. Now, obviously, if the camera would look really weird, so I'm not going to do that. But we're just going to pretend this is level to the ground for the purpose of this mini tutorial. What you want to do is you want to get the hour hand, shorthand, and point it at the sun. Now, obviously we're in a studio and we can't see the sun, but let's just say for the sake of discussion, I'm going to make the sun point, well, sort of upwards in that direction. So let's say this is pointing at the sun right now. Once you do that, you have to know whether it's the morning or afternoon. And unless you're nursing a really major hangover, you should know whether it's the morning or afternoon. So right now, I'm just going to assume it's the morning. Now, if it's in the morning, what you want to do is you want to set the south marker. Very important, south marker. In between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock marker. And so if it's the morning, which we're pretending it is right now, you'll want to set it clockwise from the hour hand, or ahead of the hour hand. So we're going to get the south here. I don't know if you get the south marker and move it so that it's in between this direction of the sun, the hour hand, and the 12 o'clock, which would be somewhere around here. If this is, well, it's roughly 5 o'clock, between 5 and 12 would be roughly 9 o'clock or so. And obviously, or so won't cut it if you want to make it out of the woods alive. But you will want to put it right around there. Right in the middle. Okay? A good way of doing this actually would really be to count each hash marker on this internal rotating bezel to give you a more accurate read on exactly where the middle is. And so once I have that set, I know that if this is pointing towards the sun, this hour hand, south is that way. And I can sort of navigate correspondingly. Now, if it happened to be in the afternoon, what you'd have to do is you'd have to set this south marker on the internal rotating bezel in between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock position, counterclockwise from the hour hand, or, well, behind the hour hand, so to speak. So I'm going to set that right now. And if it happened to be 5 in the afternoon in this case, then what would happen is south would be that way. Another important thing to remember is that this hour hand continues to move and the sun continues to move. So if you happen to be relying on this method to get you out of the woods, well, you might want to reset this every half hour, every hour, or, as you feel like you would want to reset and recalibrate. Simply because, again, the time moves, sun moves, and so, periodically you want to make sure that you are checking to be certain that you are going in the direction that you definitely want to go to. Now, if you happen to be the southern hemisphere, instead of using the hour hand to point at the sun, you would just use the 12 o'clock marker to point at the sun. Everything else would be the same. You would set the south marker in between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock marker. And again, morning, you want it to be clockwise from the hour hand or ahead. And in the afternoon, you want it to be counterclockwise from the hour hand or behind. Now, using put this away for a minute. Using the Seiko 5, it's much the same. Apologies, they're not really set. The time's not really set. But here the hour hand would be somewhere there. If we're in the northern hemisphere, I'm going to point that hour hand to the sun. And then, assuming it's the morning, we want to set the south marker in between the hour hand and the 12 o'clock marker clockwise from the hour hand, and that would mean south is somewhere that away. And if it was the afternoon, we do the reverse where we set it in between counterclockwise from the hour hand, or behind, as I like to say, and south would be that away. Some final thoughts on these two very similar watches. They are actually priced very similarly. The Prospex is just a tiny bit more expensive, but honestly, not a great deal more. Between the two, personally, I do prefer the Prospex. I like it aesthetically a little bit better in terms of just the dial, how clean it looks, and a little bit less chunky, a little bit less blocky on the hand. Although, yes, I do have a large wrist and it mitigates that a little bit. I do prefer the aesthetic on the Prospex a little bit better than the Seiko 5. But either one, quite frankly, with the price that you're paying for these watches and the functionalities, the fit and finish, you really can't go wrong with either. But that said, if it was my money, I would definitely take this. And that about wraps it up for this video with our review of the Seiko Landshark or Atlas and this Seiko, well, doesn't really have a nickname, Land Prospex. I hope you guys enjoyed checking these watches out as much as I did. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, please let us know in the comments below. If you like the videos you put out, like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the notification button so you're always updated on all the new content that we produce. So with that, thanks everyone. Take care.